The mud was the color of sin. It clung to the carriage wheels, thick and greedy, and spattered the hem of the white dress Clara May had once thought was the prettiest thing she had ever seen. Now, it felt like a burial shroud. Each lurch of the carriage, each suck and pull of the mire on the narrow road, was a heartbeat closer to damnation or freedom. She did not know which. She only knew she had to run. The voice of her father, the preacher, still echoed in her ears, full of brimstone and certainty. He had spoken of holy matrimony, of a woman's duty, of the great honor Mr. Alistair Blackwood was bestowing upon their humble family. An honor. Clara May gripped the worn leather of the seat, her knuckles white. She had seen the truth of that honor just this morning, in the bruised, downcast eyes of the young housemaid who had come to help her with the corset. The girl, no older than 17, had flinched when Mr. Blackwood's name was mentioned, a quick, bird-like terror that vanished as soon as it appeared. But Clara May had seen it. It had been the final piece of a puzzle that had been troubling her for weeks. The hushed whispers she'd overheard between her intended and a business associate from the East. Words like stubborn and discipline, spoken with a chilling relish. The way he looked at her, not with affection, but with the cold appraisal of a man buying livestock. And then, the discovery of the letters. Tucked away in his study desk drawer, letters from a woman in another territory. A woman whose penmanship grew more frantic with each page, detailing a life of quiet terror, of a hand raised in anger and a spirit slowly being crushed. He was a man who broke women like horses, and her father was leading her straight into his paddock. So she had smiled. She had let them lace the corset until she could barely draw a breath, let them pin the veil to her hair, and then, feigning a moment of private prayer, she had slipped out the back of the church. The stable boy, young Timothy, had owed her a kindness from a time she'd taken the blame for a broken cider press. A gold coin, pressed into his palm with a desperate, silent plea, was all it took. He had harnessed the small buggy, the one meant for errands, not for a wedding escape, and had looked the other way. Now, the Montana Territory was swallowing her whole. The late autumn sky, a placid blue that morning, had curdled into a heavy, bruised gray. The first snowflakes began to fall, not the gentle, festive kind, but hard, stinging pellets driven by a rising wind. They melted on the thick mud, making the road even more treacherous. The horse, a sturdy but unremarkable gelding, strained against the incline as the path began to wind its way toward the looming, pine-choked mountains. Clara May knew nothing of this land. She was a town girl, her world defined by the church steeple and the general store. The wilderness ahead was as alien and frightening as the man she was fleeing. She was cold. The fine silk of her dress offered no protection against the biting air that whipped through the open carriage. Her hands were raw from gripping the reins, her arms aching. She had been driving for hours, guided by a frantic instinct to simply go up, to go where the roads were fewer and the chances of being followed were slimmer. The snow was coming faster now, a thick, swirling curtain that turned the world to white and gray. The pines groaned under the weight of it, their branches heavy and low. Disorientation set in, a dizzying sense of being lost in a world without landmarks. The crash was not a loud, dramatic affair. It was a sickening lurch, a sharp crack of wood, and a sudden, violent tilt. A wheel, weakened by the rocky, unseen path beneath the snow, had splintered. The carriage tipped, groaned, and then surrendered to gravity, tumbling down a short, steep embankment. Clara May was thrown clear. Her head struck something hard, a rock, a tree root. She did not know. There was a searing flash of pain in her wrist as she tried to break her fall. And then the world, which had been a blinding white, dissolved into a deep and starless black. Elias Carter saw the horse first. It stood shivering at the edge of the clearing, one rein trailing in the snow, its eyes wide with fright. It was a town horse. He could tell by the cut of its harness, And it had no business this high up. Not with a storm like this rolling in. Elias shifted his weight, the old bullet wound in his thigh sending a familiar, dull ache up his leg. He had been checking his trap lines, a task he performed with the grim efficiency of a man who preferred the company of silent animals to that of loud men. He followed the tracks, the deep ruts of the carriage wheels a wound in the fresh snow. It did not take him long to find the wreck. The buggy lay on its side, a broken toy at the bottom of the gully, and beside it, half buried in a drift, was a splash of impossible white. He approached with caution. Trouble had a way of finding people, even those who went to great lengths to avoid it. And a woman in a wedding dress, unconscious in a snowstorm miles from any town, was the loudest kind of trouble he could imagine. He slid down the embankment, his limp more pronounced in the deep snow. She lay face down, her dark hair spilling from its intricate pins, dusted with white flakes. He knelt, his gloved hand reaching out to her neck. He felt for a pulse, his touch clumsy but gentle. It was there, faint and thready, but it was there. With a sigh that plumed in the frigid air, he turned her over. Her face was pale, smudged with dirt, with a nasty-looking cut on her temple. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, revealing the pale skin beneath, already turning blue with cold. Her left wrist was bent at an unnatural angle. Elias cursed under his breath. This was not his concern. He had carved out a life for himself on this mountain precisely to escape the messy, complicated lives of others. His past was a locked room, and he had no desire to let anyone else's problems pick the lock. He could leave her. He could ride to town, tell the sheriff, and let them handle it. It would take hours. She would not last that long. The cold was a patient killer. He looked at her face again. She was young, frightened, even in unconsciousness. Something in the fragile line of her jaw, the way her lashes lay dark against her pale cheek, stirred a long dormant ghost within him. He saw another face, another girl in trouble. His sister, Sarah. He shook his head, trying to banish the memory. It did no good. The past had long arms. With another curse, this one aimed at God, fate, and his own damned conscience. He scooped her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile bundle of silk and bone. He grunted with the effort, his bad leg protesting as he climbed back up the slick embankment. The walk back to his cabin was long and arduous. Each step was a battle against the snow, the wind, and the heavy burden in his arms. He held her tight against his chest, trying to shield her from the worst of the storm, his own body heat a meager offering against the encroaching frost. His plan was simple. He would get her warm, bind her wrist as best he could, and come morning, he would take her down to Doc Miller's in Harmony Gulch. He would drop her off, turn his horse around, and ride back up his mountain. He would be done with it. He would be alone again. That was all he wanted. The first thing Clara May was aware of was the smell. Wood smoke, rich and earthy. And something else, coffee, strong and black. Then came the warmth. It was a deep, penetrating heat that seemed to be pulling the chill from her very bones. She tried to open her eyes, but her lids were heavy, as if weighted down with lead. A low groan escaped her lips, and with it came the pain, a throbbing in her head, a sharp, insistent agony in her wrist, and a deep, bruised ache that seemed to reside in every muscle of her body. She forced her eyes open. The light was dim, flickering. She was lying on a narrow cot, covered with a thick pile of furs that smelled of pine and cold air. The ceiling was low, made of rough-hewn logs. To her right, a stone fireplace dominated the wall, a healthy fire crackling within it, casting dancing shadows across the small room. A cabin. She was in a cabin. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through the fog of pain. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness washed over her, and she fell back against the furs, another groan tearing from her throat. "Easy now." The voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. It came from the shadows near the fire. Clara May's head turned slowly. A man sat in a simple wooden chair, a tin cup cradled in his large hands. He was big, broad-shouldered, his silhouette made larger by the firelight behind him. He wore a dark wool shirt and canvas trousers. His face was in shadow, but she could see a thick, untrimmed beard and a mess of dark hair. He did not move from his chair, just watched her with an unnerving stillness. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "My cabin," he said. His voice held no warmth, no welcome. It was a statement of fact, nothing more. "Found you in the snow. Your carriage went off the road." The memory came rushing back, the mud, the snow, the splintering crack of the wheel. Mr. Blackwood, the escape. Her eyes darted around the cabin, looking for a way out. There was only one door, a heavy-looking plank construction. The single window was a small square, covered by a wooden shutter. She was trapped. She looked down at herself. She was still in her wedding dress, now a ruined mess of stained and torn silk. Her left arm was bound with a clean strip of linen, her wrist splinted with 2 flat pieces of wood. She could see dark, ugly bruises blooming on her forearms, marks she did not remember getting in the crash. They were the shape of fingers. Mr. Blackwood's fingers. From the day he had grabbed her arm in the library, his grip like iron, his voice a low hiss as he'd warned her about the duties of a wife. The man by the fire saw where she was looking. "Your wrist is broken. I set it as best I could. You'll need a doctor." "No," she said, the word coming out with more force than she expected. "No, doctor, please." A doctor meant the town. The town meant questions. Questions would lead back to her father, to Mr. Blackwood. The man was silent for a long moment. He took a slow sip from his cup. "I plan on taking you into Harmony Gulch in the morning. Doc Miller will see to you." "No!" This time, it was a cry of pure terror. She struggled to sit up again, ignoring the spinning in her head. "You cannot! Please, I am begging you! Do not take me back! He will find me!" The man leaned forward slightly, and the firelight caught his face. It was a hard face, weathered by sun and wind, with the lines etched around his eyes. He looked older than his years, maybe 35. There was a long, thin scar that cut through his left eyebrow. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, pale and unreadable. But as she looked into them, she saw something flicker there. Not pity, but a weary, haunted recognition. "Who will find you?" he asked, his voice still flat. My fiancé," she choked out the word. "The man I was supposed to marry. You do not understand. He is a powerful man. He will hurt me." Elias Carter understood more than she knew. He had seen that brand of terror in a woman's eyes before. He had seen it in the eyes of the young Apache girl all those years ago. He had seen it in his own sister's eyes, the night she had shown up at his door, her lips split and a dark bruise coloring her cheek. He had come to this mountain to forget those eyes, and here they were again, staring at him from a stranger's face. He wanted to say no. He wanted to tell her it was not his problem, that he had his own ghosts to wrestle with. But the word caught in his throat. The memory of Sarah was too strong. He had failed her. He had not been there when she needed him most. He could not fail this stranger, too, not in the same way. "One night," he said, the words feeling like a betrayal of the solitude he had so carefully built. "You can rest here for one night. Then you need to move on." Relief washed over Clara May so intensely that she felt weak. "Thank you," she whispered, sinking back onto the cot. "Thank you." The atmosphere in the small cabin grew thick with unspoken things. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind outside. Elias rose and ladled some broth from a pot hanging over the fire into a bowl. He brought it to her, his movements stiff and reluctant. He did not meet her eyes. "You should eat," he said, setting it on a small crate beside the cot. She tried to hold the spoon, but her right hand trembled too much, and her left was useless. A tear of frustration slid down her cheek. He watched her for a moment, his jaw tight. Then, with a quiet sigh, he took the bowl and the spoon. He sat on the edge of the crate and, with an awkwardness that spoke of long disuse of such gentle acts, he lifted the spoon to her lips. Clara May flinched at his closeness, but she was too weak and too hungry to refuse. She let him feed her. The warm, salty broth, a balm to her frozen insides. They did not speak. When the bowl was empty, he took it and returned to his chair by the fire. As the hours passed and the cabin grew darker, a deep weariness settled over Clara May, but sleep would not come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Mr. Blackwood's face, his cold smile. She saw the housemaid's terrified eyes. She saw the letters. She could not rest. Not in a strange cabin with a strange man, with the door unbarred. "Sir," she said, her voice small in the quiet room. He looked up from the fire he was staring into. Would you mind barring the door?" Elias looked at the heavy wooden bar leaning against the wall. He looked at her, at the genuine fear in her eyes. It was the same request Sarah had made. "Please, Elias, bolt the door. He might follow me." He had done it then, and it had not been enough. He rose without a word, his limp more pronounced now that he was tired. He walked to the door, lifted the heavy bar, and slid it into the thick iron brackets. The sound of it falling into place was a solid, definitive thud. It seemed to seal them in together, away from the rest of the world. He did not return to his chair. Instead, he took another blanket from a chest and settled himself on the floor by the hearth, his back against the stone, the firelight playing on his rugged profile. He would not sleep in the same room as a frightened woman. He would stand watch. Clara May watched him, a strange knot of feelings tightening in her chest. He was rough, silent, and intimidating, but he had brought her in from the cold. He had set her wrist. He had fed her. He had barred the door. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, a small, fragile sliver of safety began to take root in her heart. She lay back, the ache in her body a constant, throbbing reminder of her ordeal. The corset, still laced beneath her ruined dress, dug into her ribs with every breath. The whalebone stays were like a cage, pressing against her bruised flesh. A final, lingering piece of the life she had fled. She could not bear it another moment. It was a physical manifestation of her suffocation. She tried to reach the laces at her back, but the movement sent a lance of fire up her broken arm. She cried out, a small, muffled sound of pain and despair. Elias was on his feet in an instant, crossing the small space between them. "What is it? Are you hurt?" "My dress," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The corset, I cannot breathe. It is pressing on my ribs." She looked up at him, her eyes wide and pleading in the dim light. She saw the hesitation in his face, the reluctance to cross this new boundary of intimacy. She saw him about to turn away, to retreat back to the safety of his silence. And in that moment, she knew she could not let him. She could not be invisible, not anymore. "Please," she said, her voice gaining a strange, quiet strength. She pushed herself up to a sitting position, her good hand clutching the furs. She looked directly into his winter-gray eyes, holding his gaze, refusing to let him retreat. "Don't look away." The words hung in the air between them, simple and profound. It was not just about the corset, not just about the bruises he would see beneath it. It was a plea to bear witness, to see her, Clara May, not as a symbol of trouble, not as a damsel in a ruined dress, but as a person who was broken and afraid and in desperate need of a moment of human kindness. Elias stood frozen for a long second, the firelight flickering in his haunted eyes. He saw the bruises on her arms. He saw the terror that still lingered behind her defiance. He saw his sister's ghost standing just behind her shoulder. He had looked away once before, and it had cost him everything. He would not do it again. He gave a slow, solemn nod. He knelt beside the cot, his large, calloused hands surprisingly steady as he reached for the tangled laces of her dress. He worked in silence, his fingers carefully unthreading the silken cord, loosening the cage that held her captive. The world returned to Clara May in shades of gray. The light filtering through the cabin's single and shuttered window was thin and pale, painting the rough-hewn logs in the muted tones of a winter dawn. The fire in the hearth had been banked, its cheerful crackle reduced to a soft, rhythmic hiss. The man, Elias Carter, was gone. For a wild, panicked moment, she thought he had abandoned her, left her to the silence and the snow. But then she saw his heavy coat was missing from its peg by the door, and a pair of worn snowshoes were gone as well. He was out in the storm, not gone for good. She pushed herself up, her body a symphony of aches. The bruises on her ribs, freed from the corset's cruel embrace, throbbed with a dull, persistent rhythm. Her head still felt heavy, but the sharp pain had receded. She was wearing one of his shirts, a coarse, heavy flannel that smelled of wood smoke and the cold, clean scent of the man himself. It swallowed her small frame. The sleeves rolled up a dozen times to free her hands. He must have changed her while she slept, a thought that should have brought a fresh wave of fear, but strangely, it did not. It felt less like a violation and more like a practical act of kindness, a replacement of her ruined, damp dress with something warm and dry. With her good hand, she pushed the furs aside and swung her legs over the side of the cot. Her feet, bare and bruised, recoiled from the cold floorboards. A sharp pain shot up her ankle when she put weight on it, and she realized it must have been twisted in the crash. She was a wreck of a woman, broken and bruised from head to toe. Slowly, using the wall for support, she began to explore her small world. The cabin was one room, impeccably tidy but stark in its simplicity. Everything had a purpose and a place. A small table with 2 chairs stood near the window. A cast-iron stove, cold now, was in the corner opposite the fireplace. Shelves on the wall held a few tin plates, cups, and a small, neat stack of books. There was no clutter, no decoration, no sign that a woman had ever set foot in this place. There were no bottles of whiskey or rye, a common sight in the homes of men who lived alone. There was only the scent of pine and smoke, and a profound, bone-deep silence that seemed to have soaked into the very logs of the walls. His bed was a simple frame in the far corner, the blankets pulled taut with military precision. A single leather-bound trunk sat at its foot. This was the sum of his life, a testament to a man who owned little and wanted even less. It was the home of a man in retreat from the world, a fortress of solitude. The door creaked open, letting in a gust of frigid air and a swirl of fine, powdery snow. Elias entered, his shoulders dusted white. He carried a brace of rabbits in one hand and his rifle in the other. He stopped short when he saw her standing, her hand pressed against the wall for balance. His unreadable eyes took in her bare feet, her pained stance, and the way she swayed slightly. He said nothing. He kicked the snow from his boots, hung his coat on the peg, and set about reviving the fire. His movements were economical and precise. He did not look at her again. Yet she felt his awareness of her in the room as a palpable thing. It was as if he could sense her every pained breath, her every unsteady shift in weight. He spent the better part of the morning working at the small table, using a draw knife. He took a sturdy length of pine and began to shape it. Clara May sat on the cot and watched him, mesmerized by the rhythmic scrape of the blade against the wood. His hands, which she had expected to be rough and clumsy, were steady and sure. He worked with an intense, quiet focus, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was not just a cowboy. He was a craftsman. He was building her a crutch. He finished it just before noon, a simple but sturdy aid, the top padded with a piece of folded buckskin. He held it out to her without a word. She took it, her fingers brushing his for a fleeting second. His skin was calloused but warm. "Thank you," she whispered, He only grunted in response, turning away to tend to the rabbits he was stewing over the fire. He kept his distance, always. His kindness was a brusque and silent thing, offered in deeds, never in words. He built her a crutch, he fed her stew, he kept the fire roaring, but he did not ask her name. He did not ask where she was from or what she was running from. This absence of questions was a greater gift than any other. It allowed her to simply be, to heal without the pressure of having to weave her terror into a story for a stranger's ears. Yet, his silence was also a wall. Behind those winter-gray eyes, she could sense a deep and guarded territory, a past that was his own fortress. She wondered what had driven him to this isolation, what wounds he carried that made him so wary of human connection. The answer, had she known it, lay 10 years in the past, in the dust and heat of the Arizona territory. Elias had been younger then, not yet 30, working as a hired hand on a sprawling cattle ranch. He was good with horses, better with a gun, a quiet man who kept to himself. One sweltering afternoon, he had ridden out to check on a windmill pump and had stumbled upon a scene from hell. The rancher's son, a brutish man named Jedediah Thorne, had cornered a young Apache girl who had been fetching water from the stock tank. She could not have been more than 16. Elias saw the terror in her eyes, the same animal panic he had seen in the eyes of cornered deer. Thorne was drunk, his face flushed with a cruel sort of pleasure. Elias had not thought, he had simply acted. A cold, clear rage, the likes of which he had never known, had washed over him. He had pulled Thorne off the girl, his voice a low, deadly command. Thorne, enraged at being challenged, had gone for his gun. It was not a duel of honor. It was a squalid, dusty affair that was over in a matter of seconds. Elias was faster. His bullet struck Thorne square in the chest. But Thorne, in his dying spasm, had managed to fire his own pistol. The shot had torn through Elias's thigh, shattering the bone and leaving him with the limp that would plague him for the rest of his life. He had saved the girl, but the law did not see it that way. He had killed the son of a powerful rancher. There was no trial, just a bounty on his head. He became a fugitive, a man haunted by a righteous act that had branded him a killer. The guilt was not for killing Thorne. That he would do again in a heartbeat. The guilt was for what came after. The girl, shamed and terrified, had vanished into the desert. He never knew what became of her, and the consequences had driven him into the shadows, into a self-imposed exile where he could harm no one, and no one could harm him. He had traded the world of men for the silence of a mountain. That evening, as the snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the world in a deep and profound quiet, Clara May found her voice. They sat by the fire, the stew simmering on the hearth, the only light coming from the dancing flames. "My father is a preacher," she began, her voice soft, as if she were afraid the sound of it might shatter the fragile peace. Elias did not look at her, but she saw his hands still on the rifle he was cleaning. He was listening. "He believes a woman's will is a thing to be broken, like a wild horse. He says it is God's design." She paused, tracing the grain of the wooden crutch with her finger. "The man he chose for me, Mr. Blackwood, he believed the same. He was much older, a pillar of the community. My father said, rich, respected." She spoke in fragments, her narrative disjointed, leaping from one memory to the another. She told him of the veiled threats, the coldness in her fiancé's eyes, the bruises she had seen on a housemaid's arm. She did not weep. Her voice was flat, detached, as if she were recounting a story that had happened to someone else. It was the only way she could speak of it at all, by creating a distance between herself and the pain. Elias listened. The rhythmic scrape of his cleaning rod against the inside of the rifle barrel, the only sound that answered her. When she finally fell silent, her story hanging in the air between them like smoke. He still said nothing. He simply finished his task, stood up, and ladled a bowl of stew for her. In his silence, she did not find judgment or disbelief. She found something far rarer, a quiet acceptance. He had heard her words, and he had not turned away. The next day, she felt a little stronger. A fierce, desperate need for self-sufficiency rose in her. She could not bear to be a complete invalid, a burden. While Elias was outside chopping wood, she saw that the water bucket by the door was nearly empty. Using her new crutch, she hobbled to the door, picked up the heavy wooden bucket with her good hand, and stepped out into the knee-deep snow. The cold was a shock, a physical blow that stole her breath. The path to the well was a short but treacherous journey. She took a few unsteady steps, the crutch sinking into the soft powder. Her injured ankle protested with a sharp, searing pain. She gritted her teeth and pushed on. She was almost there when her crutch slipped on a patch of hidden ice, her balance gone. She cried out as she fell, tumbling into a snowdrift, the bucket flying from her hand. She lay there, gasping, the cold seeping into her clothes, tears of frustration and helplessness freezing on her cheeks. She was so weak, so utterly useless. Suddenly, strong hands were on her, lifting her from the snow as if she weighed nothing at all. Elias had seen her fall. He carried her back inside, his face a grim mask, and set her down gently on the chair by the fire. He said nothing, but a muscle in his jaw twitched, the only sign of his agitation. He stoked the fire until it roared, then disappeared back outside. He returned with the bucket, now full of fresh, clean water. He poured some into a basin and set it on the hearth to warm. He knelt before her and, without a word of permission, began to unlace her worn boots. Clara May pulled back instinctively. "No, you do not have to." "Your feet are soaked," he said, his voice rough. It was the first full sentence he had directed at her all day. "They will freeze." He slid the boots off, revealing her small, bruised feet, already red and numb with cold. He took a clean cloth, dipped it in the warm water, and gently began to bathe them. His touch was surprisingly tender, his large, calloused fingers carefully washing away the grime and the cold. The intimacy of the act was staggering. No man, other than her father when she was a small child, had ever touched her feet. A lifetime of sermons on the weakness of the flesh and the sinfulness of the body had been ingrained in her. As his thumb brushed against the sensitive arch of her foot, she flinched, a sharp, involuntary jerk. Elias froze. He dropped the cloth back into the basin and pulled his hands away as if he had been burned. A dark, shuddered look came over his face. "I am sorry," he muttered, his voice thick with a self-loathing that stunned her. He started to rise, to walk away, to retreat back behind his wall of silence. She saw him leaving, not just from the room, but from her. She saw him looking away. "Wait," she said, her voice catching in her throat. He stopped, his back to her. I asked you not to look away." He turned slowly. The pain and confusion in his eyes was so raw, so naked. It made her breath catch. He did not understand. He thought his touch had frightened her, that he had caused her more pain. "It was not you," she tried to explain, her voice a near whisper. "It is just, I am not used to kindness." He stood there for a long moment, the space between them charged with 1,000 unspoken words. Then he knelt again. He picked up the cloth and, with infinite care, resumed his task. This time, she did not flinch. That night, the ghosts came for her. She dreamt of Mr. Blackwood's hands, his thick fingers gripping her arms, his face looming over hers, his breath smelling of stale wine. She could feel the stays of the corset tightening, squeezing the air from her lungs. She was trapped, suffocating. She woke with a strangled cry, sitting bolt upright on the cot, her heart hammering against her ribs, the cabin's shadows twisting into menacing shapes. Elias was awake instantly. He was sitting by the dying embers of the fire, a dark shape in the gloom. He had not been asleep. "A bad dream," she managed to stammer, her body trembling uncontrollably. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He did not tell her it was all right. He simply rose and came to her. He pulled back the furs on his own bed, the one in the corner. It was an invitation, silent and absolute. Hesitantly, she left the cot, her bare feet cold on the floorboards. She slid under his furs, curling into a tight ball at the very edge of the bed, as far from him as she could get. He lay down on his own side, his back to her. He did not touch her, but his presence, the solid, steady warmth of his body just a few feet away, was a bulwark against the darkness. The scent of him, pine, smoke, and clean earth, chased away the phantom smell of stale wine. For the first time since she had fled her own wedding, she felt truly safe, and in that safety, she slept. A thaw began, as slow and incremental as the melting of a mountain glacier. They began to share more than silence. One afternoon, he took a book from his small shelf. It was a worn copy of Shakespeare's sonnets. He opened it and began to read aloud, his rough voice stumbling at first, then finding a steady, quiet cadence. He read not to her, but to the room, to the fire, as if it were a habit he had long kept. She listened, the beauty of the words a balm to her frayed spirit. She, in turn, began to speak of things other than her fear. She told him about her mother, who had loved flowers and had died when she was young. She told him about the books she had read in secret, stories of adventure and far-off lands, small, careful offerings of self, placed into the quiet space between them. Sometimes, a short smile would pass between them, when he tripped over a difficult word in his reading, or when she, attempting to cook, nearly set a dish rag on fire. They were fleeting, fragile things, these smiles, but they were as welcome as the sun after a long winter. Elias found himself watching her. He would look up from his work to see her sitting by the fire, her head bent over a book he had given her, the firelight catching the auburn highlights in her dark hair. A strange, unfamiliar feeling would tighten in his chest, something that felt dangerously like hope. He would scold himself for it. She was a bird with a broken wing, and his cabin was just a temporary perch. Soon she would be strong enough to fly away, and he would be alone again. It was better that way. It was safer. But one evening, he went to the small wooden trunk at the foot of his bed. He opened it, the scent of cedar and memory rising to meet him, from beneath a pile of folded clothes. He took out a small, worn book. He opened it to the middle pages, pressed between them. As delicate and fragile as a butterfly's wing, was a single, dried rose. It was a deep, velvety red, its color faded but still rich. It was the last thing his sister had given him before she left, before her husband's cruelty had finally driven her away for good. He walked over to the cot where Clara May was resting. He held it out to her, his hand trembling slightly. He offered no explanation, no words. He did not need to. In his eyes, she saw the history of the flower, the weight of the memory it carried. It was a piece of his guarded heart, a treasure from his fortress of solitude, and he was giving it to her. The silence of the mountain had become a language Clara May was beginning to understand. It spoke in the whisper of wind through the pines, the soft crunch of snow underfoot, and the distant, lonely cry of a hawk circling the gray sky. For several days, a fragile peace had settled in the small cabin, a quiet rhythm of shared chores and lengthening silences that were no longer tense, but companionable. But the peace was as thin as the ice on the creek. Their supply of smoked meat was dwindling, and the stew pot was more broth than substance. "We need meat," Elias said one morning, his voice a low rumble that seemed to shake the quiet air. He did not look at her as he spoke, his attention fixed on oiling the action of his rifle. "I will track a deer. You will stay here, keep the fire high, bar the door behind me." A familiar chill of fear touched Clara's heart. The thought of being alone, even with the door barred, was unnerving, but a stronger, newer feeling rose to meet it, a stubborn refusal to be a helpless burden. "I will come with you," she said, her voice firmer than she expected. He finally looked at her, his winter gray eyes sweeping over her, taking in the flannel shirt that hung on her frame, her mended but still clumsy movements with the crutch. "No, you are not strong enough. The snow is deep." "My leg is better," she insisted. A small lie. The ankle still sent sharp protests up her leg with every step. "I can walk without the crutch for a short way. I can be quiet. I can carry the second rifle." He stared at her for a long moment, a battle of wills playing out in the space between them. He saw the fierce determination in her eyes, the same spark of defiance he had seen the night she had begged him not to look away. He knew it was a fool's errand to argue with a woman who had already run from a life she refused to accept, with a sigh that was part exasperation, part something else he could not name. He gave a curt nod. "Stay close. Do exactly as I say." He bundled her in a spare coat made of heavy wool and buffalo hide, a garment so large it made her feel like a child playing dress-up. He checked the load in the second, smaller rifle and handed it to her, showing her with brief, efficient movements how to hold it, how to sight it. The cold, heavy weight of the weapon in her hands felt alien and terrifying. She had been taught that such things were the tools of violent men, instruments of sin. Now, her survival might depend on one. They moved through the forest like ghosts. Elias walked ahead, his limp barely noticeable in the deep snow, his senses on high alert. He moved with a predator's grace, his eyes scanning the trees, the ground, the slightest disturbance in the white landscape. Clara followed in his tracks, her breath pluming in the frigid air, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and a strange, exhilarating sense of freedom. This was the first time she had been more than a few feet from the cabin since the crash. The world felt vast, wild, and achingly beautiful. The snow-laden pines stood like silent sentinels, their branches creating intricate patterns against the stark white sky. They had been tracking a set of deer prints for nearly an hour when Elias suddenly stopped, holding up a hand for silence. He pointed to a thicket of aspen up ahead. Clara could see nothing, but she trusted his instincts. He motioned for her to stay put, to get down behind a fallen log. He slipped away, melting into the trees, the rifle held at the ready. Clara knelt in the snow, her own rifle clutched in her trembling hands. The silence was absolute, broken only by the frantic beating of her own heart. Minutes stretched into an eternity. She strained her ears, listening for the crack of his rifle. The attack came not from the thicket, but from the rocks above. A low, guttural snarl ripped through the air, a sound that vibrated deep in her bones. She looked up and saw a flash of tawny fur, a blur of muscle and teeth. A cougar, lean and hungry from the long winter, launched itself from a rocky ledge directly onto Elias. The world exploded into chaos. The man and the beast went down in a flurry of snow and snarled fury. Elias's rifle flew from his hands, landing uselessly in a deep drift. Clara screamed, a raw, ragged sound torn from her throat. The cougar was on top of him, its claws tearing at the thick buffalo coat, its teeth snapping inches from his face. Elias roared, a sound of pure, primal rage, as he fought to keep the animal's jaws at bay with his bare hands. For a frozen second, Clara was paralyzed by terror. Her mind screamed at her to run, to hide, to save herself. But then she saw the blood, a dark, crimson stain spreading across the snow beneath Elias's shoulder. He was losing. Something inside her snapped. The preacher's daughter, the timid girl who had never raised her voice, vanished. In her place was a woman fighting for the only person in the world who had shown her kindness. She raised the rifle, her arms shaking so violently she could barely aim. She remembered his instructions. Sight down the barrel. Squeeze the trigger. Do not jerk it. She tried to get a clear shot at the animal's head, but it was a maelstrom of movement, a tangle of fur and fury. She aimed for the creature's body, prayed to a god she was no longer sure she believed in, and fired. The explosion was deafening. The recoil slammed the rifle butt into her shoulder, knocking her backward into the snow. The smell of gunpowder filled the air. The cougar shrieked, a sound of pain and rage, and leaped off Elias. It turned, its yellow eyes blazing with hate, a dark, wet patch spreading on its flank. It took a limping step toward her, and then, as if its rage could not overcome its injury, it turned and vanished back into the rocks. Silence descended once more, heavy and absolute. Clara scrambled to her feet, her ears ringing, and ran to Elias. He lay still in the snow, his face pale, his eyes closed. The left shoulder of his coat was shredded, and blood pumped from a deep gash, staining the pure white snow a sickening red.
"Elias,"
she cried, falling to her knees beside him.
"Elias, please."
His eyes flickered open. They were clouded with pain, but they were focused on her.
"Did it?"
he gasped, his voice a hoarse whisper. "It is gone," she said, her voice trembling.
"I hit it. It ran."
He tried to sit up, a low groan of agony escaping his lips.
"The shoulder, deep."
She had to stop the bleeding, now. Panic warred with a desperate, newfound resolve. She looked around frantically. There was nothing, only snow and trees. Her hands went to the hem of her own clothes, the rough flannel shirt and wool trousers he had given her, not absorbent enough. Then she remembered. Beneath the heavy coat, beneath the flannel shirt. She still wore the chemise and petticoats from her wedding day, the last remnants of the girl she had been. Without a second thought, she tore at the fine linen of her petticoat, the sound of ripping fabric a small, violent punctuation in the stillness of the forest. It was not enough. She needed more bandages, more pressure. Her eyes fell on the ruined wedding dress, bundled in a corner of the cabin. She looked at the blood spreading in the snow, at the life seeping out of the man who had saved her. With trembling hands, she began to tear the long, elegant train of her silk wedding dress into strips. The fabric that was meant to signify a new beginning was now being repurposed to prevent an ending. Each tear was a final, definitive severing of her past. She was no longer a bride on the run. She was a woman trying to save a life. She packed the silk strips against the wound, pressing down with all her might. "We have to get you back to the cabin," she said, her voice tight with urgency. With her help, he staggered to his feet. The journey back was a nightmare. He leaned heavily on her, his arm draped over her shoulders, each step an agony that made him grunt in pain. His blood soaked through the makeshift bandages, dripping onto her coat, a warm, terrifying stain. By the time they reached the cabin door, he was barely conscious, his weight a dead thing she could no longer support. He collapsed over the threshold, pulling her down with him. She managed to drag him to the cot, his boots leaving a trail of bloody snow across the floorboards. She stoked the fire until it blazed, the room growing blessedly warm. With shaking hands, she cut away the remnants of his coat and shirt, bearing the wound. It was worse than she had feared. 4 deep gashes, parallel and precise, laid open his shoulder and chest, down to the muscle. The bleeding was slower now, but it had not stopped. She knew she had to clean it. Doc Miller, the town doctor, had once taught the church ladies about basic wound care, a lesson she had paid little attention to at the time. Now, she clung to the fragments of his advice. Clean water, whiskey, if you have it, pressure. There was no whiskey in the cabin. She heated water over the fire and, taking a deep breath, began to gently clean the blood from his skin. He was conscious, his eyes following her every move, his jaw clenched against the pain. She worked with a focus she did not know she possessed, her trembling hands slowly steadying. She was no longer afraid. There was no room for fear, only for the task at hand. As she cleaned the blood from his chest, her fingers brushed against the hard, corded muscle beneath his skin. The heat of his body radiated into her hands. His breathing became strained, a ragged, hitching sound. At first, she thought it was from the pain, But then she looked at his face. His eyes were dark, intense, fixed on her with an expression she could not decipher. It was not agony. It was something else. Something raw and vulnerable. She finished cleaning the wounds and began to bind them tightly with fresh strips of her wedding dress. The white silk against his blood-streaked skin was a startling contrast. Her hands were gentle, her movements sure. She had found a strength she never knew she had, a well of calm in the midst of chaos. He had not taken his eyes off her. The tension in the small room was a living thing, thick and suffocating. It was the tension of shared trauma, of a life nearly lost and a life unexpectedly saved. It was the tension of a man and a woman, alone and wounded, in the heart of a vast, indifferent wilderness. She tied the final knot and looked down at her work. Her hands were covered in his blood. A wave of dizziness washed over her, the adrenaline of the past few hours finally beginning to recede. She swayed, and his good hand shot out, his fingers wrapping around her wrist, steadying her. His touch was electric, a jolt that went straight through her.
You saved me first,
she whispered, the words barely audible over the crackle of the fire. He pulled her closer, his eyes searching hers, looking for something she could not name, and then he kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was hungry, desperate, a collision of fear and relief and a longing that had been simmering beneath the surface for days. It was the kiss of a man starved for human contact, and a woman who had forgotten what it felt to be held by anything other than fear. His lips were rough, demanding, and she met his hunger with her own, her hand coming up to cup the back of his neck, her fingers tangling in his dark, unruly hair. The kiss deepened, a raw and desperate communication that said everything they had not been able to put into words. It spoke of loneliness and shared pain, of a fragile trust forged in silence and shadow. For a fleeting, breathless moment, there was nothing else in the world but the two of them, clinging to each other as if to a life raft in a storm-tossed sea. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. Elias tore himself away, a choked gasp escaping his lips. He looked at her, his face a mask of horror and self-loathing. He scrambled back on the cot, his movement aggravating his wound, a fresh wave of pain contorting his features.
I am sorry,
he rasped, his voice thick with shame. I should not have. You do not know what I have done. He turned his face away, unable to meet her gaze. The rejection was a physical blow, sharper than any pain she had yet endured. The warmth of the kiss turned to ice in her veins. He was pushing her away, retreating back behind his walls, leaving her alone once more. She felt a sob rising in her throat, a wave of grief and confusion, and a hurt so profound it stole her breath. She could not stay in that room. She fled, stumbling out the door and into the falling snow, heedless of the cold. She collapsed a few feet from the cabin, the tears she had held back for so long finally coming, hot and fast, freezing on her cheeks. She wept for the girl she had been, for the woman she was becoming, and for the man in the cabin who was as broken and lost as she was. A moment later, she felt a heavy weight settle over her shoulders. It was his good coat. Elias stood behind her, a dark silhouette against the white landscape. He said nothing, just stood there, a silent guardian in the swirling snow. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and ragged. You should not be out here. You will catch your death. Why did you do that? She whispered to the uncaring trees. Why did you push me away? He was silent for a long time. Then, with a deep, shuddering sigh, he sank to his knees in the snow beside her. Because you see me as some kind of hero, he said, his voice raw with a pain that had nothing to do with his physical wounds. And I am not. I am a killer. He told her everything. The words came out in a torrent, as if a dam had finally broken. He told her about the Arizona Territory, about the rancher's son, Jedediah Thorne, and the young Apache girl. He described the look in Thorne's eyes, the cold, cruel pleasure he took in another's fear. He spoke of the rage that had consumed him, the blur of the gunfight, the sight of Thorn falling in the dust. "I killed him," Elias said, his voice flat and empty. "And I would do it again. That is the sin of it. I am not sorry for what I did, but it cost me everything." He then spoke of his sister, Sarah, his voice growing softer, choked with a guilt that was a decade old. He told Clara how Sarah had been married to a man like Thorn, a man who used his fists to prove his love. He told her how Sarah had come to him one night, bruised and terrified, begging for help. He had given her shelter, but he had not known how to save her. He had urged her to be patient, to pray. A few months later, she was dead from a fall down the stairs, a fall no one believed was an accident. "I told her to be strong," Elias whispered, his face buried in his hands. "I should have taken her away. I should have killed him, too. I saved a stranger, and I let my own sister die. I ran. I came up here to hide from the ghost of what I am, a man who brings ruin to everyone he touches." Clara listened, her own tears forgotten. She heard his story not as a confession of a killer, but as a testament of a man who had tried to do right in a world full of wrong, and had been broken by it. His pain mirrored her own. They were two sides of the same tarnished coin. She reached out and took his hand, her small fingers lacing through his larger, calloused ones. She brought his hand to her cheek, pressing his cold skin against her tear-stained face. "Then maybe we were both ruined by someone else's sin," she said softly. He looked up at her then, his eyes filled with a raw, astonished vulnerability. In her gaze, he did not find judgment or fear. He found a reflection of his own sorrow. And something else, acceptance. For the first time in 10 years, he felt the crushing weight on his soul begin to lift. They stayed like that for a long time, kneeling in the snow as the sky darkened around them, two broken souls finding solace in the shared landscape of their pain. That night, they slept in the same bed, fully clothed. They lay facing each other under the heavy furs, the silence between them no longer a barrier, but a shared space of understanding. Sometime in the deep of the night, his hand found hers, their fingers brushing, a tentative, feather-light touch that was more intimate than any kiss. Nothing more happened, but in that quiet, shared darkness, everything changed. The next morning, the world felt new. A fragile hope had dawned with the pale winter sun. Clara woke first, determined to care for him. She tried to cook breakfast, her movements clumsy with her injured wrist. The smell of burning bacon soon filled the cabin. Elias woke to the smell and the sight of her, looking flustered and beautiful in the morning light. A smudge of soot on her nose, a slow, rusty smile touched his lips. He got out of bed, his shoulders stiff and aching, and went to her side. He took the fork from her hand and gently moved her aside. "Let me," he said, his voice still rough with sleep. He showed her how to cook the bacon slowly, how to make coffee that was strong but not bitter. They worked side by side in the small space, their shoulders brushing. And as she fumbled with a plate, nearly dropping it, he caught it, and they both started to laugh. It was a soft sound at first, hesitant and unused. Then it grew into a genuine, shared moment of lightness. It was the first time either of them had truly laughed in a very long time, and the sound filled the small cabin, chasing away the last of the shadows. Later that day, Elias knew he had to go to town. Their supplies were dangerously low, and he needed proper medical supplies for his shoulder. He saddled his horse, his movements slow and pained. Clara stood in the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself, a worried expression on her face. "Be careful," she said. "I will," he promised, his eyes lingering on her for a moment longer than necessary. The ride down the mountain was slow. The town of Harmony Gulch was a small, grimy collection of wooden buildings huddled in the valley. As Elias rode down the muddy main street, His eyes scanned the notice board outside the sheriff's office. It was a habit, the cautious instinct of a man who had once had a price on his head. And then he saw it. A new poster, the paper still clean and white against the weathered wood. His blood ran cold. It was a drawing of a young woman with dark hair and wide eyes. The likeness was crude, but it was unmistakably Clara May. Beneath it, in bold black letters, were the words, "Missing, Clara May Thorogood, daughter of preacher Jeremiah Thorogood." And then, the line that made his heart stop. "A substantial reward is offered for her safe return and for information leading to the arrest of any man found aiding or harboring her." The poster was signed by her father and by the powerful, respected Mr. Alistair Blackwood. The ride back up the mountain was a journey through a landscape of ghosts. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like the hoofbeats of pursuing men. The wanted poster was burned into Elias's mind. The crude drawing of Clara's face a mockery of her real, breathing beauty. The words a death sentence for the fragile peace they had built. The bounty was not just for her, it was for him. For any man who harbored her. Mr. Blackwood had not just put a price on her freedom. He had turned every stranger into a potential enemy, every town into a trap. He had bought the supplies, flour, salt, coffee, and proper linen bandages from the doctor's office, paying with the last of his carefully hoarded cash. He had kept his head down, his hat pulled low, his answers to the storekeeper's pleasantries clipped and short. But he felt the weight of 100 eyes on him, the casual glances of men in the street now feeling like assessments, their minds silently calculating the worth of a woman's life and a man's betrayal. When the small, smoke-plumed silhouette of his cabin came into view, a wave of profound sorrow washed over him. It had been his sanctuary, his fortress of solitude. Now it was a cage, a hiding place that could no longer offer protection. He was bringing the danger back with him, tucked into his saddlebags alongside the flour and the coffee. Clara was waiting at the door, her face lighting up when she saw him. The pure, unadulterated relief in her eyes was a knife in his gut. She had been worried for him, for his safety. She had no idea that he was now the greatest threat to hers.
"You were gone so long,"
she said, her voice soft. She reached out to take the horse's reins, her movements still careful but gaining in confidence.
"I was afraid."
"The trail was iced over," he lied, swinging down from the saddle. The movement sent a jolt of fire through his wounded shoulder, a dull, physical echo of the sharper pain in his soul. He avoided her eyes, busying himself with the saddlebags. Had to take it slow. He carried the supplies inside, the familiar warmth of the cabin feeling like a bitter mockery. She followed him, her presence a gentle, questioning shadow at his back. He could feel her watching him as he put the things away. Her silence more unnerving than any interrogation. He had grown accustomed to their quiet companionship, but this was a different kind of silence. It was heavy, burdened, full of the things he was not saying. He said nothing through the long evening. He stoked the fire, checked the dressing on his shoulder, and sharpened his hunting knife with meticulous, obsessive focus. He was building a wall of mundane tasks between them, a barrier of silence she could not breach. But Clara was no longer the frightened girl who had stumbled into his life. She had faced down a cougar, stitched a man's flesh back together, and listened to the darkest secrets of his soul. She would not be put off by a wall of silence. After a supper of biscuits and bacon eaten with the tension crackling between them like static in the air, she finally confronted him. He was staring into the fire, his profile hard and unforgiving in the flickering light, his mind 1,000 miles away.
"Elias,"
she said, her voice steady. He did not look at her. "You have seen something." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. He continued to stare into the flames, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of his chair. "Town is the same as always, muddy and full of fools." "Do not lie to me," she said, her voice rising slightly. Not after everything. I can see it in your eyes. I have felt it since the moment you returned. The world has followed us here, has it not?" He finally turned to look at her, and the raw anguish in his face made her breath catch. The careful mask of indifference was gone, replaced by a weary, haunted despair. "Clara," he began, his voice rough, "there is something you need to know." He confessed it all in a low, flat tone, as if reciting a verdict that had already been passed. He told her about the poster, the crude drawing of her face, the names of her father and Alistair Blackwood. He told her about the reward, and the final, damning line about arresting any man found harboring her. She listened, her face growing paler with each word. The small bubble of safety she had felt in this cabin, the fragile hope that she had truly escaped, burst, leaving behind a cold, terrifying emptiness. She was still a prisoner, just one with a much larger cage. "So," he continued, his eyes fixed on a point on the floor, unable to bear the sight of her devastation. "In the morning, I will pack you some food. There is a spare horse, an old mare. She is gentle. I will ride out first. Head west. Make a show of it. Draw anyone who might be looking in that direction. You will wait an hour. Then you will ride south. Follow the creek down out of the mountains. It will lead you toward the lower territories. You can lose yourself there. Find a new town, a new name." His plan was sensible. It was logical. And it felt like a betrayal. The hurt was a raw, physical ache in her chest. "You are sending me away," she whispered. "I am keeping you safe," he corrected, his voice harsh with a pain he was trying to conceal. "Safe?" Her voice cracked. She stood up, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "I thought I was safe here, with you. You said I could stay." "That was before," he said, getting to his feet as well. He towered over her, his size for the first time feeling not protective, but intimidating. "That was before I knew I was putting a bounty on your head just by letting you breathe the same air as me." "So you will just cast me out? Send me back into the world alone, with nothing but a horse and a sack of food?" The injustice of it, the cruelty, made her voice tremble with a rage she did not know she possessed. "I am not a parcel to be sent away when I become inconvenient. Elias!" "This is not about convenience," he roared, his voice echoing in the small cabin. It was the first time he had ever raised his voice to her, and she flinched, a reaction so ingrained it was instinct. The sight of her recoil broke him. The anger drained out of him, leaving him looking hollowed out, defeated. "I am protecting you," he said, his voice now a low, desperate plea. She looked at him, at the agony in his eyes, at the way he held his wounded shoulder as if to keep himself from falling apart, and in that moment, she understood. It was not just about Blackwood. It was about his sister. It was about his past. It was about his deeply held belief that he was a curse. "From whom are you protecting me?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper that was more powerful than any shout. She took a step closer, forcing him to meet her gaze. "The men outside or the man inside?" The question struck him with the force of a physical blow. He had no answer. She had seen right through him, past the practicalities of the plan, and into the terrified heart of his own self-loathing. He was sending her away, not just to save her from Blackwood, but to save her from himself. Clara saw the truth in his silence. It was the final, unbearable straw. The strength that had held her together for weeks finally crumbled. A sob tore from her throat, a ragged, ugly sound of a heart breaking. She turned away from him, stumbling toward her cot, intending to pack, to flee, to do as he commanded, but her legs would not hold her. She collapsed onto the furs, her body racked with a grief so profound it felt like it would tear her apart. The sound of her weeping shattered the last of his resolve. He could face down a cougar. He could endure a gunshot wound. He could live with the ghosts of his past, but he could not endure the sight of her pain, knowing he was the cause of it. In 2 long strides, he was beside her. He knelt in front of her, his hands hovering, wanting to comfort her but feeling he no longer had the right. "Clara," he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears.
Do not.
She looked up at him, her face streaked with tears, her eyes shimmering with a pain that mirrored his own. He reached out, his calloused thumb gently wiping a tear from her cheek. His touch was hesitant, trembling. He lifted her face, his gaze tracing every line of her features as if trying to memorize them. And then he kissed her again. This kiss was nothing like the first. There was no desperation, no hunger. It was slow, reverent, a prayer in the form of a touch. It was a kiss of surrender, a final, silent confession of a love he could no longer deny. His lips were soft, questioning, and she responded with a quiet, desperate sob that he swallowed with his own. It was a kiss that spoke of apology, of longing, of a future he was terrified he would destroy. He pulled back, resting his forehead against hers, their breath mingling in the cold air. "I cannot do it," he whispered. "I cannot send you away." He lifted her into his arms and carried her to his own bed in the corner of the cabin. He laid her down gently on the furs, his movements tender and deliberate. The firelight cast flickering shadows on the walls, creating a small, sacred space in the heart of the vast, dangerous wilderness. He lay down beside her, his body a warm, solid presence in the darkness. He did not remove her clothes, nor his own. He simply held her, his hand stroking her hair as her sobs slowly subsided into quiet, shuddering breaths. This, she thought, was an intimacy deeper than any she could have imagined. To be held in her brokenness, to be seen in her despair, and not to be abandoned. After a long time, he began to undress her, his fingers slow and clumsy on the buttons of the flannel shirt. His touch was not one of passion, but of care, as if he were tending to a wound. He removed the shirt, the trousers, until she lay before him in her simple chemise. He looked at her, his eyes full of a raw, aching tenderness that made her heart ache. He kissed the bruises on her arms, the ones that had been a gift from Mr. Blackwood. He kissed the scar on her temple from the carriage crash. He kissed the corner of her mouth, where a tear still lingered. Each kiss was a gentle act of healing, an attempt to erase the pain that had been inflicted upon her. This time, when his mouth found hers again, it was a slow, deliberate exploration, a question she answered without words. His hands, so large and rough, were impossibly gentle as they moved over her, charting the lines of her body with a reverence that made her tremble. There was an aching restraint in his every touch, a hesitation that spoke of his deep-seated fear of hurting her, of taking anything from her that she was not ready to give. He would stop often, pulling back to look into her eyes, waiting for a sign, for a word. And each time he did, she would whisper the words that had become their prayer, their creed. "Don't look away." It was a plea, a command, a promise. It was her asking him to stay present, to see her, all of her, in this most vulnerable of moments. It was her giving him permission to let go of the ghosts of his past, to be here, with her, now. He moved over her, his body a welcome weight, a shield against the world outside. There was no pain, no fear, only a profound sense of coming home. It was a joining not just of bodies, but of souls, a tender, raw, and sacred act of two broken people making each other whole. In the heart of the dark, lonely cabin, under the silent watch of the winter moon, they found a salvation they had never known to seek. And as she clung to him, she whispered it again and again, not in fear, but in triumph. "Don't look away." Morning came too soon, the pale light filtering through the window, cold and gray. Clara woke slowly, a sense of peace settling deep in her bones. She reached out for Elias, but the spot beside her was empty. The furs were cold. She sat up, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach.
"Elias?"
she called out, her voice small in the sudden, vast silence of the cabin. His coat was gone, his rifle was gone, his horse was gone. On the small table, weighted down by the dried rose he had given her, was a piece of folded paper. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. The handwriting was rough, labored, the words of a man unaccustomed to putting his heart on a page. It was not a long note. Clara, I cannot ask you to live a life on the run because of me. You escaped one prison. I will not be the reason you enter another. You deserve a life that does not start in hiding. Go south. Do not look back. Elias. The note fell from her fingers. He was gone. He had given her one perfect night, a glimpse of a life she could have, and then he had vanished, sacrificing himself for what he believed was her freedom. He still did not understand. Her freedom was not a place. It was not a life without a past. It was him. A fire ignited in her, a blaze of fury and love so fierce it burned away the last of her fear. He thought he could save her by leaving her. He was a fool, a brave, noble, beautiful fool. She would not let him face the world alone. She would not let him sacrifice himself for a ghost. She dressed quickly, her body aching but her mind clear and resolved. She packed the remaining food into a saddlebag. She took the dried rose and tucked it safely into a pocket. Then she went outside into the biting cold. The old mare stood patiently in the small lean-to, her breath pluming in the air. Clara had never saddled a horse in her life, but she had watched Elias do it a dozen times. Her movements were clumsy, her fingers numb with cold. But she did it. She led the horse out into the snow, its tracks falling beside the ones Elias had left only an hour or two before. She was weakened. She was terrified, but she was no longer running away from anything. For the first time in her life, she was riding toward someone. She was riding after him. The horse was a plodding, patient creature, its head bowed against the biting wind as it followed the tracks Elias had left in the snow. Clara rode with a grim determination that had nothing to do with physical strength. Her body was a vessel of pain. Her muscles screamed in protest. Her injured wrist throbbed with a dull, insistent fire, and a deep, soul weariness threatened to pull her from the saddle. But her will was a newly forged thing, sharp and unbreakable. He had run to save her from himself, to fall on a sword she had never asked him to raise. She was riding to save him from his own noble, misguided heart. The descent from the mountain was a slow, treacherous affair. The world opened up below her, a vast, unforgiving panorama of white plains and dark, distant hills. After hours that felt like an eternity, the cluster of buildings that was Harmony Gulch appeared in the valley, a smudge of gray and brown against the snow. A plume of wood smoke rose from a handful of chimneys, the only sign of life in the frozen landscape. She did not ride into the center of town, an instinct she did not know she possessed. A caution born of her recent ordeal made her circle around the edge, keeping to the sparse cover of the cottonwood trees that lined a frozen creek. From there, she could see the muddy main street, the saloon, the general store, and the small, squat building with the faded sign that read, Sheriff. And then she saw them. A small knot of men stood outside the sheriff's office. She recognized Elias's horse tethered to the hitching post, and she recognized Elias. He stood between two men, one wearing a sheriff's star, the other a younger deputy. His hands were not bound, but his stance was one of quiet resignation. He was not fighting. His face, what she could see of it from this distance, was a mask of stone, his eyes fixed on some distant point only he could see. He had turned himself in. He had walked into the trap to ensure she would be free. A wave of cold fury, pure and absolute, washed over Clara, burning away the last of her exhaustion. She urged the old mare forward, out from the cover of the trees and onto the main street. Her appearance caused a small stir. Heads turned. Men standing on the boardwalk of the general store stopped their conversations to stare at the strange, disheveled woman in clothes far too large for her, riding a horse they did not recognize. She ignored them all. Her world had narrowed to the scene in front of the sheriff's office. The sheriff, a portly man with a thick gray mustache and weary eyes, looked up as she approached, his expression shifting from grim satisfaction to outright confusion. Elias heard the horse and turned his head. When he saw her, his stone-faced composure shattered. A look of pure, horrified disbelief washed over his features. "Clara, no," he breathed, the words lost in the wind, but she read them on his lips. He took a step toward her, but the deputy put a hand on his arm, stopping him. She slid from the saddle before the horse had even come to a complete stop, her legs trembling but holding. She walked directly toward the sheriff, her gaze unwavering. "You will let him go," she said, her voice not loud, but carrying with a clarity that cut through the murmuring of the onlookers. The sheriff, a man named Miller, blinked, taken aback by her audacity. "Ma'am, this is official business. This man is under arrest for harboring a fugitive." He gestured vaguely at the wanted poster still tacked to the wall, her own crudely drawn face staring back at her. "I was not a fugitive," Clara said, stopping directly in front of him. She was small, and he was large, but she did not back down. "I was a victim. And that man," she said, her voice softening as she looked at Elias, at the anguish in his eyes, "that man saved my life." "Now, miss, I have a poster here signed by your father and Mr. Alistair Blackwood," Sheriff Miller said, his tone a mixture of paternal condescension and official duty. "They are worried sick about you. They are offering a reward." "The reward," Clara said, her voice laced with a cold fury, "is for the return of property. Mr. Blackwood does not see a wife. He sees a broodmare and a house servant, and my father sees a business transaction." A gasp went through the small crowd that had gathered. Such words, spoken by a woman, a preacher's daughter no less, were a profound shock. "You will come inside, ma'am, and we can discuss this calmly," the sheriff said, clearly flustered. "I will speak here," Clara insisted, her voice ringing in the cold air, "where everyone can hear the truth. You want to know why I ran? Because I discovered the man I was to marry finds his pleasure in the pain of women. Because I found letters detailing his cruelty. Because I saw the bruises on his housemaid's arms, and I knew the same fate awaited me." The scandal erupted like a lit powder keg. The street, which had been merely curious, was now silent, captivated. This was more than a runaway bride. This was a public accusation against a powerful man, a defiance of the natural order of things. "He is a monster, hiding behind a veneer of wealth and piety," Clara continued, her voice gaining strength with every word. "And this man, Elias Carter, found me half dead in a snowstorm. He took me in. He set my broken wrist. He tended my wounds. He defended me from a wild animal, and nearly died for his trouble. He did this not for a reward, but because he is a good and decent man. And for that, you put him under arrest?" Sheriff Miller's face was a study in conflict. He was a man of the law, and the law, in the form of the poster, was clear. But he was also a man who had seen his share of human ugliness, and the raw, unshakable conviction in this young woman's voice felt more genuine than any piece of paper. He looked at Elias, who stood silent, his eyes full of a terrible, protective pride for the woman who was defending him. He looked at Clara, standing there like a fierce, wounded bird, and then back at the wanted poster. He was caught between his duty and his conscience. "All right," he said finally, his voice a low growl of frustration. He scrubbed a hand over his face. "That is enough of a spectacle for one day. Both of you, inside. We are going to sort this out." He looked at his deputy. "Put them in the back cell, together. I do not want them separated." The crowd murmured as the sheriff led them inside, the heavy door of his office closing with a definitive thud. The interior was small and dusty, smelling of old paper and stale coffee. There were 2 cells at the back, iron-barred cages that were cold and grim. The sheriff unlocked one and gestured them inside. The iron door clanged shut behind them, the sound echoing the finality of their situation. They were prisoners, ruined, both of them, in the eyes of the town. News of the confrontation spread through Harmony Gulch faster than a winter fire. In the general store, a group of men argued the matter. Some sided with Blackwood, a man of property and standing. Others were swayed by the passion of the girl's testimony. The storekeeper, a balding man named Henderson, spoke up. "I do not know about all that," he said, wiping the counter with a cloth. "But I know Elias Carter. He has come in here for years. Never a loud word, never a lick of trouble. Pays his debts, keeps to himself. He does not strike me as the kind of man to kidnap a preacher's daughter." Across the street, an older woman, the widow Gable, who was known for her sharp tongue and her kind heart, had watched the entire scene from her window. She put on her shawl and marched over to the sheriff's office. She carried a thick wool blanket and a thermos of hot broth. She did not ask the sheriff's permission. She simply told him that no matter what the law said, that girl looked half frozen and was not going to spend the night on a cold cot without some warmth. The sheriff, who had known Mrs. Gable his entire life, was wise enough not to argue. Inside the cell, the silence stretched, thick and heavy. The single, high window was barred, letting in a slice of gray, unforgiving sky. Elias stood with his back to her, his good hand gripping the cold iron bars. His shoulders slumped in defeat. "You should not have come," he said, his voice a low, broken thing. "You should not have left," she countered softly. She walked toward him, her footsteps soft on the stone floor. "Did you truly think I would let you do this? Let you sacrifice yourself for me?" "I was saving you," he said, still not turning around. "You were running," she corrected gently. "From me, from what we are. You were so afraid of ruining me that you chose to ruin yourself instead." He finally turned to face her. The anguish in his eyes was a raw, open wound. "Look at us, Clara. We are in a jail cell. Your name is being dragged through the mud. You are disgraced. I have brought you to this." She reached out, her fingers touching the back of his hand where it gripped the bars. "No, my father's ambition and Mr. Blackwood's cruelty brought me to this. You brought me back to life." She looked around the small, cold cell, at the iron bars that separated them from the world. It was a place of shame, of public ruin. They had nothing left but the truth of what they were to each other. She had to know if it was enough. "Elias," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. She looked into his eyes, her own heart in her gaze. "Would you still hold me?" she asked, the words catching in her throat. "If we were both ruined." He let go of the bar and turned his hand over, lacing his fingers through hers. The warmth of his touch was an anchor in the cold, uncertain world. He looked at her tear-bright eyes, at the fierce, unyielding love on her face. He saw not the ruined preacher's daughter, but the woman who had faced down a cougar, who had challenged a town, who had ridden through a storm to save him from himself. He brought her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Clara," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer hide. "I have never held anything gentler." A tear slid down her cheek, but it was not a tear of sorrow. It was a tear of release, of a love so profound it eclipsed the cold iron bars and the judgment of the world. In that moment, in that grim and lonely cell, they were freer than they had ever been. They were still holding hands through the bars when the door to the sheriff's office opened again late that afternoon. A man they had never seen before stepped inside. He was dressed in a dark, well-tailored suit, a stark contrast to the rough-spun clothes of the locals. He carried a leather satchel and an air of quiet authority. "Sheriff Miller?" the man asked, his voice calm and professional. "I am him," the sheriff said, looking up from his paperwork. "My name is Jonathan Hale. I am an attorney from Helena," the man said. I have come on a matter concerning a Mr. Alistair Blackwood. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. What about him? I represent a consortium of investors who have been defrauded by him. Mr. Hale said, opening his satchel and producing a sheaf of legal documents. He has a long and sordid history of using coercion and fraudulent land claims to acquire property. I have warrants for his arrest from 2 different territories. I was tracking him to this area when I heard the commotion concerning his intended bride. Sheriff Miller took the papers and began to read, his eyebrows climbing higher on his forehead with every line. The man who had presented himself as a pillar of the community was, in fact, a wanted criminal, a con artist who preyed on the vulnerable. Clara's accusations were not just the hysterical ramblings of a runaway bride. They were the final piece of a much larger, darker puzzle. The sheriff read the documents twice. Then he slowly stood up, a look of dawning comprehension on his face. He walked to the back of the room and took a heavy iron key from a hook on the wall. He unlocked the cell door and swung it open. It seems, he said, looking at Clara with a newfound respect, that your fiancé is the one who should be in this cell. He then turned to Elias, his expression one of gruff apology. Mr. Carter, you are free to go. I apologize for the misunderstanding. They stepped out of the cell, blinking in the relative brightness of the office. They were free. But as they walked out onto the main street, the setting sun casting long, cold shadows, they knew this was not the end. The law had released them, but Alistair Blackwood was still out there. He was a rich man, a vengeful man, a man who would not take kindly to being publicly humiliated and exposed. The law in these territories was a thin and fragile thing. It might protect them today, but it offered no guarantee for tomorrow. They had won their freedom, but they would have to run to keep it. They did not stay in the jail cell for long. Sheriff Miller, his face a mask of gruff embarrassment, released them into the biting cold of the late afternoon. The townsfolk who had gathered to watch the spectacle now looked on with a mixture of pity, respect, and morbid curiosity. Clara May Thorogood, the preacher's runaway bride, was no longer just a local scandal. She was a woman who had spoken a forbidden truth, and in doing so, had brought down a man far more powerful than anyone in this small, forgotten corner of the Montana Territory. The widow Gable, her face etched with the hard-won wisdom of a long life, was waiting for them on the steps of the sheriff's office. She clutched a thick wool shawl around her shoulders and looked at Clara not as a disgrace, but as a survivor. "You will come with me," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. "My house is warm, and my stew is hot. You look like you are about to be blown over by a strong breeze." She then fixed her sharp, bird-like eyes on Elias. "You too, Mr. Carter. You look like you have been wrestling with the devil himself. The least this town can do is offer you a decent meal and a safe bed for the night." Elias, who had spent a decade avoiding the company and charity of others, found himself unable to refuse. There was a strength in the old woman that reminded him of the granite cliffs of his mountain. They followed her to a small, tidy house at the edge of town, a place that smelled of baking bread and dried lavender. For one night, they were safe. The next morning, the reality of their situation settled in with the cold light of dawn. They were free, but they were also exposed. News traveled fast, and Alistair Blackwood was not a man to accept defeat gracefully. His wealth and influence stretched across territories, and his vengeance would be a patient and ruthless thing. Elias was a man of action, his mind already working through the practicalities of survival. While Clara rested, he went to the general store. He used the money he had to buy a sturdy pack horse and supplies for a long journey: salted pork, beans, coffee, a bag of oats for the horses, and 2 heavy wool blankets. He bought Clara a pair of boys' trousers made of durable canvas, a warm flannel shirt, and a pair of sturdy, fleece-lined boots that would fit her. He then went to the livery and purchased the old mare she had ridden into town. She was a gentle, reliable beast, and Clara had grown fond of her. His final purchase was a map, a detailed drawing of the Western Territories. He brought his acquisitions back to Mrs. Gable's house and spread the map out on her kitchen table. Clara came and stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. The map was a daunting sight, a vast, empty space of mountains, deserts, and rivers, dotted with the names of places that seemed a world away. "We cannot stay here," Elias said, his voice low. He traced a line south with his finger, across the plains of Wyoming, through the mountains of Colorado. "We will head for the New Mexico Territory, or maybe Arizona. It is a hard country, but a man can disappear there. We can find a small valley, build a new cabin, a place where no one knows our names." It was a future she could barely imagine, a blank page waiting to be written. The fear was still there, a cold knot in the pit of her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, soaring hope. A life with him, a life of their own making. It was more than she had ever dared to dream of. She looked at the map, at the long, arduous journey that lay ahead, but before she could look forward, she knew she had to look back one last time. "Before we go," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "I have to go back to the cabin." Elias looked up from the map, his brow furrowed with concern. "Clara, it is not safe. It is the first place they would look if they sent men after us." "They will not," she said. "They think we are here, in the town. We will be quick. I need to go back. There is something I must do." "We have everything we need," he argued gently. "There is nothing for us up there now." She turned to face him, her eyes pleading for him to understand. "Yes, there is," she said. "The girl I was is still there. The frightened, broken girl in the torn wedding dress. I cannot take her with me on this journey. Elias, I have to leave her behind. I want to go back and say goodbye." He looked at her, at the unshakable resolve in her gaze. He saw that this was not a whim, but a pilgrimage, a necessary ritual for the healing of her soul. He had spent a decade running from his own past. He could not deny her the chance to confront hers. He slowly folded the map, a silent act of concession. "All right," he said. "We will go at first light." The ride back up the mountain felt different. They were not a rescuer and a victim, not a keeper and a fugitive. They were partners, riding side by side, their horses' breath pluming in the frigid air. The silence between them was comfortable, a shared language of understanding. The world was still and white, the snow muffling all sound, creating a sense of profound and peaceful isolation. They found the cabin just as they had left it, half buried in a fresh fall of snow. A thin curl of smoke still rising from the chimney where the embers of their last fire clung to life. It looked small and insignificant against the vast, towering backdrop of the mountains. But to Clara, it was the most important place in the world. It was the place where she had been broken, and the place where she had been remade. Inside, the air was cold, but the small space was filled with the ghosts of the past weeks. She could almost see herself lying on the cot, weak and terrified. She could see Elias sitting by the fire, a silent, watchful guardian. She ran her hand along the rough-hewn table where he had carved her crutch. She touched the furs on the bed where they had found solace in each other's arms. Elias rebuilt the fire, his movements sure and familiar. Soon, a welcome warmth began to fill the small room, chasing away the chill. He then went outside to tend to the horses, leaving her alone with her memories. Clara went to the corner where her ruined wedding dress lay in a heap, a crumpled, ghostly relic of a life she had barely escaped. She picked it up. The silk was stained with mud and blood, his and hers, a testament to their shared ordeal. The dress was no longer a symbol of a gilded cage, but of a desperate, violent rebirth. She took the last remaining piece of her bridal attire, the fine linen chemise she had worn under it all. It was the last thread connecting her to the preacher's daughter, to the girl who had been raised to be silent, obedient, and afraid. She held it in her hands for a long moment, a silent farewell, Then she walked to the hearth. She did not toss it into the flames with anger or with hatred. Her gesture was one of solemn release. She laid the fine linen on the glowing embers and watched as the fire took it. The delicate fabric blackened, curled, and then erupted into a bright, clean flame, consuming the last vestiges of her old life. Turning the sorrows of the past into smoke and ash that drifted up the chimney and disappeared into the vast, uncaring sky, she was free. She was still standing by the fire when Elias came back inside. He saw the look on her face, the serene, quiet strength in her eyes, and he knew she had found what she came for. He came and stood behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. He rested his chin on her head, and they stood together in silence, watching the last of the embers die down. That night, they made love again. It was not born of fear or of a desperate need for comfort. It was a slow, deliberate act of love, a confirmation of the life they were choosing to build together. The world outside, with its dangers and its judgments, ceased to exist. There was only the warmth of the fire, the softness of the furs, and the profound, healing tenderness of their touch. It was a joining of two souls who had been lost and had, against all odds, found their way home in each other. Later, as they lay tangled together in the warm afterglow, the firelight dancing on the log walls, Elias reached up and touched the small, tarnished silver locket that always hung around his neck. Clara had seen it many times, but he had never spoken of it. She knew, instinctively, that it was a sacred object, a connection to the ghosts he carried. He sat up and, with a strange, solemn reverence, unfastened the clasp. He held the locket in the palm of his calloused hand, the silver warm from his skin. "This was my sister's," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper. "She gave it to me the last time I saw her. For 10 years, I have worn it to remind myself of what I lost, to remind myself of how I failed her." He opened the delicate clasp. Inside, there was no portrait, only a small, tightly folded piece of paper. He had never opened it. He was afraid of what it might say. The unopened note was a symbol of his guilt, a wound he had kept fresh for a decade. With a deep, shuddering breath, he looked at Clara, her face soft and beautiful in the firelight. He saw not a replacement for his past, but a promise of a future. He saw a love that was strong enough to heal even the deepest of wounds. He closed the locket without reading the note. The past no longer had power over him. He pressed the locket into her hand and closed her fingers around it. "I do not need it any more," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that was a decade in the making. He looked into her eyes, and in his, she saw a man finally laying his ghosts to rest. "You are the only thing I want to remember now." She clutched the locket, the small, silver heart a heavy, precious weight in her hand. It was not just a piece of jewelry. It was his past, his pain, his trust. It was the key to the last locked room in his soul, and he had just given it to her. They left at dawn. The world was sheathed in a crystalline layer of frost, the air so cold it hurt to breathe. The rising sun painted the eastern sky in pale shades of rose and gold, promising a new day, a new beginning. They did not look back at the small cabin as they rode away. They had taken everything they needed from it. They rode side by side, two small silhouettes against the vast, majestic landscape of the frost-covered mountains. The future was an unknown territory, a blank map full of potential dangers and hardships. But they would face it together. They were no longer two broken halves, but one whole, strong enough to withstand any storm. She had once begged a man to see her. Now, she rode beside one who never looked away. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from so we can all connect. Please subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel for more tales, and feel free to share your thoughts in English.